What if the image of strength and vitality you have in your mind of one of America's most famous presidents was a carefully crafted delusion? Imagine a leader who smiled for the cameras, who inspired a nation with his energy, but who was, in private, almost never without pain. A man who suffered from crippling illnesses from the time he was a small boy right up until his final moments. This isn't just a story about a president, it's the story of John F. Kennedy, a man born into incredible wealth, but whose character was forged in the quiet, lonely fires of physical suffering. How he went from a hospital bed to facing down the end of the world is one of the most incredible stories of the 20th century. A story of hidden pain, relentless ambition, and a destiny that would change the world forever. To truly understand the man, John F. Kennedy, we can't just start with his birth. We have to go back further, to the world his family came from, a world of poverty, prejudice, and a burning desire to not just survive, but to conquer. The story of JFK is inseparable from the story of the Kennedys and the Fitzgeralds, two Irish families who clawed their way from the bottom of society to the very pinnacle of American power. Their journey, their ambition, and their ghosts would shape the boy, the man, and the president in ways that are impossible to overstate. Before there was a President Kennedy, there was a dream born in the potato fields of famine-stricken Ireland and carried across a cold ocean to a city that did not want them. Boston in the mid-19th century was a hostile place for the Irish. Signs reading "No Irish Need Apply" were common. They were seen as poor, uneducated, and a drain on society. It was into this world that JFK's great-grandparents arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a fierce will to endure. On his father's side was Patrick Kennedy, who left County Wexford in 1849. He worked as a cooper, making barrels on the Boston docks. Life was hard, and he died young from cholera, leaving behind a wife and young children, including a son named Patrick Joseph Kennedy, or PJ. This was JFK's grandfather. PJ was a quiet, unassuming man, but he was smart. He didn't have the flash of other politicians, but he had a keen sense for business and people. He started with a small saloon, then another, and another. In the world of working-class Boston, saloons were more than just bars. They were community centers, places where deals were made and political alliances were forged. PJ used this to his advantage, slowly building a small political empire in his ward. He was a behind-the-scenes guy, a man who understood that true power wasn't always about being the loudest voice in the room. On his mother's side was the other great Irish dynasty of Boston, the Fitzgeralds. JFK's maternal grandfather was a man who was the complete opposite of PJ Kennedy. His name was John Francis Fitzgerald, but everyone in Boston knew him as Honey Fitz. He was a born politician, charming, charismatic, and a relentless campaigner. He could sing Irish ballads, shake every hand in a room, and remember the names of everyone's children. He worked his way up from a local ward boss to a U.S. congressman and eventually became the first Irish Catholic mayor of Boston. Honey Fitz was a symbol for the Boston Irish. He was proof that they could beat the Protestant elite, the Boston Brahmins, at their own game. The Kennedys and the Fitzgeralds were rivals, two powerful families competing for influence in the same small city. So, when PJ Kennedy's son, Joseph Patrick Kennedy, decided he wanted to marry Honey Fitz's daughter, Rose Fitzgerald, it was more than just a marriage, it was a merger. It was the union of two dynasties, combining PJ's quiet financial sense with Honey Fitz's political charisma. And at the center of this union was Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., JFK's father. If you want to understand JFK's relentless drive, you have to understand Joe Kennedy. He was a man of breathtaking ambition. He saw the prejudice his father and grandfather had faced, and he swore that his family would never be second-class citizens. He wanted more than just Boston, he wanted the world. He graduated from Harvard, a place that looked down on the Irish, and he set out to make a fortune so large that no one could ever ignore him or his family again. He started in banking, becoming the youngest bank president in the country at the age of 25. Then he went to Wall Street during the Roaring Twenties. It was a wild and regulated time, and Joe Kennedy knew how to play the game. He engaged in practices that would be illegal today: insider trading, stock manipulation, but he was brilliant at it. He famously said he knew it was time to get out of the stock market when he started getting stock tips from a shoeshine boy. He pulled all his money out just before the great crash of 1929, making his family's fortune secure while the rest of the country plunged into the Great Depression. But he wasn't done. He took his money to Hollywood and became a movie mogul, running his own studio. He had a famous affair with the silent film star Gloria Swanson and learned how to use the power of image in media, a lesson he would later pass on to his sons. After Hollywood, he turned to politics, becoming a major supporter of Franklin D. Roosevelt. FDR rewarded him by making him the first chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the very agency created to regulate Wall Street. It was like putting a fox in charge of the henhouse, but Joe Kennedy knew all the tricks, and he did a surprisingly good job. His ultimate prize was being appointed the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain in the years leading up to World War II. This should have been his crowning achievement, but it was in London that his ambition finally collided with his flawed judgment. As Hitler was rising in Germany, Joe Kennedy became a passionate supporter of appeasement. He believed that war with Germany was a terrible idea and that Britain should negotiate with Hitler. His views became increasingly unpopular, and he was seen by many as a defeatist. When the war began, his political career was effectively over, and it was this failure that solidified the great, all-consuming ambition of his life. If he could not be president, then one of his sons would be. All the money, all the power, all the connections he had built were for one purpose: to put a Kennedy in the White House. He and his wife, Rose, a devoutly religious and incredibly disciplined woman, raised their 9 children in a household that was more like a training camp for greatness. It was a world of intense competition. Dinner table conversations were like political debates. Sports, especially touch football, were played with a brutal intensity. The family motto was simple: winning was everything. There was no prize for second place. And the chosen one, the star of the family who was destined to fulfill his father's dream, was the eldest son, Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. He was everything his father wanted him to be: athletic, confident, a natural leader. Everyone in the family, including his younger brother Jack, knew that Joe Jr. was the one destined for the presidency. Jack was the second son, and in the Kennedy clan, that meant he was in a permanent shadow. This intense, pressure cooker environment, combined with a secret he would carry for the rest of his life, is where the story of the 35th president truly begins. John Fitzgerald Kennedy entered this world on May 29, 1917, a world of privilege, power, and overwhelming expectations. On the surface, it looked like he was born with a golden ticket to a perfect life, but from the very beginning, Jack's life was a constant, private battle. The charisma and strength the world would later see were built on a foundation of secret illnesses and the relentless pressure of his family. As a little boy, Jack was incredibly frail. The Kennedy household was full of healthy, robust, and competitive children, but Jack was different. He seemed to catch everything. His medical records from childhood read like a textbook of diseases. He had whooping cough, measles, mumps, and chickenpox, but it was more than just the usual childhood sicknesses. When he was just turning 3 years old, he contracted scarlet fever, a bacterial infection that was often a death sentence for children in the pre-antibiotic era. For weeks, he lingered near death. His father was so terrified he would lose his second son that he rushed to a hospital in Boston and personally administered a new type of treatment. Jack barely survived, but the illness ravaged his young body and seemed to leave his immune system permanently compromised. Throughout his childhood and teenage years, he was constantly sick. He suffered from mysterious, high fevers that doctors couldn't diagnose. He had severe asthma, which made the intense physical competition with his siblings even more difficult. He was plagued by digestive problems that would cause severe abdominal pain, a condition that would later be diagnosed as colitis. He was skinny, often underweight, and seemed to be in a perpetual state of recovery from one ailment or another. His mother, Rose, was a stickler for detail and kept index cards on each of her children's health. Jack's file was by far the thickest. He spent long stretches of his childhood in hospitals or confined to his bed at home. But in the Kennedy family, sickness was seen as a weakness. Complaining was not an option. His father, in particular, had little patience for it. So Jack learned, from a very young age, to hide his pain. He developed a detached, often humorous way of talking about his health issues, downplaying their severity. It was the beginning of a lifelong habit of presenting a strong, healthy image to the world while privately enduring almost constant discomfort. Instead of feeling sorry for himself during his long stays in bed, Jack used the time to read. Books became his escape and his education, while his older brother Joe Jr. was outside, leading the other kids in sports. Jack was inside, devouring stories of heroes and history. He loved tales of adventure, of courageous leaders who overcame impossible odds. He read about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, about British history, and about the great figures of the ancient world. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were shaping his view of the world and his own place in it. They were teaching him about courage, leadership, and the idea that one person could change the course of history. This love of reading gave him a different kind of strength than his brothers. Joe Jr. was the physical leader, the doer. Jack was becoming the observer, the thinker. He developed a sharp, inquisitive mind and a dry, witty sense of humor that often caught people off guard. It was his shield, a way to deflect questions about his health and to hold his own in a family that valued outward strength above all else. The competition between the Kennedy brothers was legendary. Joe Sr. deliberately pitted them against each other, believing it would make them tougher. Joe Jr., being the oldest and healthiest, almost always won. He was bigger, stronger, and more confident. Jack, in order to compete, had to rely on his intelligence and his wit. But this constant struggle to keep up with his older brother, especially with his physical limitations, took a toll. It was during his teenage years that the most persistent and debilitating of his health problems began: chronic back pain. The family story was that he injured his back playing football at Harvard. But the truth is, his back problems likely started much earlier and were probably related to his generally poor health. By the time he was a teenager, the pain was sometimes so severe that he could barely walk, and yet, he pushed himself relentlessly, trying to live up to the impossible standards set by his father and personified by his brother. He was sent to Choate, a prestigious and demanding prep school in Connecticut. It was here that he began to develop his own identity, separate from his family. He was still often sick, missing long periods of school, but he was also known for being a rebel. He and his friends formed a group they called the Muckers Club. Their goal was to defy the school's strict rules and cause as much harmless trouble as possible. The headmaster was not amused and threatened to expel him. It took a call from his powerful father to smooth things over. This rebellious streak wasn't just teenage fun, it was a sign of his independent mind, a refusal to simply accept authority without question. Despite his mischievous nature and his frequent absences due to illness, he managed to do well enough to get into Harvard, following in his father's and brother's footsteps. It was at Harvard that Jack began to truly shine intellectually. He was no longer just the sickly younger brother. He was coming into his own. He traveled through Europe just as the continent was on the brink of war, and his father, then the ambassador, arranged for him to have access to high-level political figures. This trip was a turning point. He saw history unfolding before his eyes. He returned to Harvard and wrote his senior thesis on why Great Britain had been so unprepared for Hitler's aggression. It was a sharp, insightful piece of analysis. His father, ever the promoter, used his connections to get it published as a book. Titled Why England Slept, it became a surprising bestseller. For the first time, Jack had achieved a major success that was all his own, based on his intellect, not his physical prowess. But even as he was gaining intellectual confidence, his body continued to betray him. The back pain grew worse, the digestive problems persisted. He was in and out of clinics, seeing specialist after specialist, but no one could give him a definitive diagnosis. He was a young man in his early 20s who looked handsome and charming on the outside, but who was living in a body that felt like it was falling apart. This constant, hidden struggle was the furnace that forged his character. It gave him a deep understanding of suffering and a quiet empathy for others. It taught him how to endure, how to push through pain without complaint. It gave him a sense of detachment, an ability to observe a crisis with a cool, analytical mind. And it may have also contributed to his famous risk-taking, A man who lives with the possibility of debilitating illness every day might have a different perspective on life and death. The handsome, smiling, privileged son of Joe Kennedy was learning a lesson more important than anything taught in a classroom: how to live with a secret, how to project an image of strength while your body is at war with itself. This secret would follow him all the way to the White House. As the 1930s gave way to the storm of global war, John F. Kennedy stood at a crossroads. He had just graduated from Harvard in 1940, a published author and the son of one of the richest men in America. With his fragile health, no one would have blamed him for sitting out the conflict. He could have easily secured a comfortable, safe job in Washington, D.C., far from the fighting. But that was not the Kennedy way. The family ethos, driven into him by his father, was one of duty and service, especially in a time of national crisis. More than that, his older brother, Joe Jr., the family's golden boy, had already joined the Navy and was training to be a pilot. For Jack, watching from the sidelines was simply not an option. Despite his chronic and severe back problems, which should have made him medically ineligible for service, Kennedy was determined to fight. He first tried to enlist in the Army but was rejected due to his back. Undeterred, he began a months-long regimen of exercises to strengthen his back just enough to pass the physical. When that wasn't enough, his father used his influence. A call was made, and the Navy's medical standards were quietly overlooked. In late 1941, just before the attack on Pearl Harbor, John F. Kennedy was commissioned as an ensign in the U.S. Navy. His initial assignments were stateside, working in intelligence. But Jack was restless. He didn't want to fight the war from behind a desk. He wanted to be where the action was. He pulled strings again, pushing for a command at sea. In 1943, he finally got his wish. He was promoted to lieutenant and given command of a patrol torpedo boat, PT-109, and sent to the South Pacific. The world of PT boat warfare was one of the most dangerous assignments in the Navy. These boats were small, fast, and made of plywood. They were packed with fuel, torpedoes, and machine guns, making them incredibly vulnerable to enemy fire. Their job was to operate under the cover of darkness, speeding through enemy-controlled waters to attack larger Japanese warships and supply barges. It was a job for daredevils, and the crews were typically young, aggressive, and lived with the constant knowledge that any night could be their last. For Jack, despite his physical ailments, this was the ultimate test, and that test came on the moonless night of August 2, 1943, in the Blackett Strait of the Solomon Islands. PT-109 was on patrol with a handful of other boats, searching for a convoy of Japanese ships. As they idled their engines to avoid detection, the massive silhouette of a Japanese destroyer, the Amagiri, suddenly appeared out of the darkness, traveling at high speed. There was no time to react. The destroyer ran directly into PT-109, splitting the small wooden boat in half. The impact was catastrophic. A massive fireball erupted as the boat's fuel ignited. Men were thrown into the black, oil-slicked water. 2 crew members were killed instantly. For the 11 survivors, including Kennedy, it was a scene from hell. They were floating in the middle of enemy territory, miles from the nearest friendly island, their boat destroyed, and the water around them was known to be teeming with sharks. This is where the legend of JFK was truly born, not in a political speech, but in the dark, desperate waters of the Pacific. Kennedy, who had been at the helm, was slammed against the cockpit wall, violently aggravating his already terrible back injury. But his instincts as a commander took over. He immediately began gathering his men, shouting to them in the darkness to make sure they were alive. He found one of his crew, Patrick McMahon, badly burned and semi-conscious, with his own back screaming in agony. Kennedy grabbed the strap of McMahon's life jacket in his teeth and began the long, grueling swim towards a small, distant island, towing the wounded man behind him. It took them over 4 hours to reach the island, which was little more than a tiny, barren patch of coral and sand. For the next 6 days, Kennedy's leadership was all that kept his men alive. The island had no food or water. He organized his crew and led them on another swim, over 3 miles this time, to a larger island where they found coconuts to eat. But they were still stranded, with no way to signal for help. Refusing to give up, Kennedy, along with another officer, decided to swim into a dangerous channel where they thought they might be able to flag down a passing American PT boat. They spent hours in the water, clinging to a piece of wreckage, but no boats came. Exhausted and suffering from exposure, they were swept away by the current and only barely managed to make it back to their crew. Their salvation finally came through a stroke of luck and Kennedy's own ingenuity. Two native Solomon Islanders, Bayuku Gasa and Aroni Kumana, who were secretly working as scouts for the Allies, discovered the stranded crew. Kennedy, using his pocket knife, carved a message onto a smooth green coconut shell. The message detailed their position and situation. He gave it to the two islanders, who then paddled their canoe for miles through treacherous, Japanese-patrolled waters to deliver it to the nearest Allied base. The message on the coconut worked. A rescue mission was launched, and on August 8, Kennedy and his surviving crew were finally saved. For his incredible leadership and bravery, Kennedy was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, but the deeper impact was internal. The experience had tested him to his absolute limits and beyond. He had faced death and had not only survived but had led his men to safety. He had proven himself, not just to his father or his country, but to himself. The fragile, sickly boy was gone for good, replaced by a man who understood duty, sacrifice, and the heavy weight of command. He returned home a war hero. The story of PT-109, helped along by an article written by the famous journalist John Hersey and promoted heavily by his father, became a national sensation. But the war had one more, even more devastating blow to deliver to the Kennedy family. In August 1944, just a year after the PT-109 incident, Jack's older brother, Joe Jr., was killed. He had been piloting a bomber on a top-secret, highly dangerous mission over Europe when his plane exploded in midair. The death of Joe Jr. shattered the family, but for Joe Kennedy Sr., it also meant a shift in his grand plan. All the hopes, dreams, and ambitions he had placed on his eldest son were now transferred to his second son. Jack, the war hero, the survivor, was now the one who would carry the family's destiny. The weight of his father's dream, a dream that had cost his brother his life, now rested entirely on his shoulders. The political machine would begin to turn, and it would turn with Jack at its center. Part 4. The Political Apprentice. When John F. Kennedy returned from the war, he brought with him more than just medals and a heroic story. He carried the quiet gravitas of someone who had faced death and come out wiser. He was still physically fragile. The PT-109 incident had done permanent damage to his back, leaving him in even more chronic pain, but he had developed a calm authority that people noticed instantly. His father, ever the strategist, sensed the timing was perfect. America was rebuilding after the war, and voters were hungry for new faces, fresh voices, and war heroes they could believe in. In 1946, just a year after the war ended, the political machine that Joe Kennedy Sr. had been building for decades roared to life. A congressional seat in Massachusetts' 11th District, a working-class, heavily Irish area of Boston, became available. Jack, at only 29 years old, launched his first political campaign. Many political insiders were skeptical. They saw him as a rich kid, an outsider who had grown up in New York and London, not in the tough neighborhoods of Boston. They assumed he would try to win based on his family name and money alone. But Jack surprised them. He campaigned with a relentless intensity that defied his physical condition. He threw himself into the race, shaking every hand he could, visiting factories at dawn, climbing stairs in tenement buildings, and engaging with voters in a way that felt genuine and personal. He would often start his speeches with a self-deprecating line, "With my father's money and my brother Joe's courage, we're going to win this." His war record earned him immediate respect, but it was his disarming charm, his quick wit, and his sharp intellect that won people's hearts. The Kennedy family mobilized completely. His mother and sisters hosted countless tea parties for female voters, a novel campaign strategy at the time. His father's money funded a slick and professional campaign that overwhelmed his opponents. Jack won the election handily, and in January 1947, he stepped into the House of Representatives. During his 6 years in the House, Kennedy learned the mechanics of Washington. He wasn't a particularly influential congressman. He was often more focused on foreign policy than on the day-to-day legislative grind. He positioned himself as a thoughtful, independent-minded Democrat, sometimes questioning his own party's positions. It was during this time that he began to develop his public persona, that of a serious, yet charismatic leader. He was learning how to listen, when to speak, and what to avoid. But he was still a young man, and Washington in the late 1940s was a vibrant social scene. He became known as one of the city's most eligible bachelors, often seen at parties with beautiful women. He was handsome, famous, and wealthy, a combination that made him a constant subject of gossip columns. By 1952, his sights were set much higher. He decided to challenge the powerful Republican incumbent, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., for a seat in the U.S. Senate. Lodge was a political giant in Massachusetts. He was from one of the state's oldest and most respected Boston Brahmin families, and he seemed unbeatable. The race was fierce, expensive, and closely watched by the entire nation. It was a classic battle, the old Protestant establishment versus the new Irish Catholic powerhouse. Once again, the Kennedy machine went into overdrive. The campaign was a family affair. His younger brother, Robert Bobby Kennedy, served as his campaign manager, earning a reputation for being tough and relentless. His sisters and mother held the famous Coffee with the Kennedys events, which brought out thousands of women. His father poured millions of dollars into advertising and get-out-the-vote efforts. The strategy paid off. In a stunning upset that shocked the political world, Kennedy defeated Lodge. At just 35 years old, he was now Senator John F. Kennedy. As a senator, Kennedy's national profile continued to grow, but in private, his health was deteriorating into a full-blown crisis. He was secretly diagnosed with Addison's disease, a rare and potentially fatal disorder of the adrenal glands that affects the body's ability to regulate stress. A minor infection or injury could send his body into shock. This diagnosis was kept a closely guarded secret. If it had become public, it would have ended his political career instantly. On top of that, his back pain had become so excruciating that he could barely function. He was often on crutches and sometimes had to be carried. In 1954, he made the risky decision to undergo 2 complex spinal fusion surgeries. The first surgery was not successful, and he developed a severe infection. His condition became so critical that a priest was called to administer the last rites of the Catholic Church, and not the first, nor the last time this would happen in his life. He was literally at death's door, but somehow, he pulled through. He spent the better part of a year recovering, a long and agonizing period of his life that he spent almost entirely out of the public eye. It was during this recovery that he worked on the book that would make him a household name. Profiles in Courage was a collection of stories about U.S. senators who had risked their careers to stand up for their principles. The book was a massive success and, to the surprise of many, won the Pulitzer Prize for biography in 1957. Years later, it would be revealed that his longtime speechwriter and aide, Ted Sorensen, had done much of the research and writing for the book. But at the time, the prize solidified Kennedy's image as not just a politician, but a scholar and a man of substance. Throughout all of these, the secret illness, the near-death experiences, the constant pain of the Kennedy mystique was carefully protected. The public saw only the handsome, smiling, vigorous young senator. They knew nothing of the daily struggle, the reliance on a cocktail of medications, or the incredible physical courage it took for him to simply get through a day. He was already planning his next move, the one his father had been preparing him for his entire life. Despite it all, his political star only rose higher. His speeches began to echo with national ambition. The complete story of JFK, the making of a president, was a tale of incredible resilience. A man who was building a platform for the highest office in the land while simultaneously fighting a secret war just to keep his own body from falling apart. By the late 1950s, John F. Kennedy had become one of the most recognizable and exciting figures in American politics. He was young, articulate, and polished, a refreshing contrast to the older, more conservative political establishment of the Eisenhower era. Behind the scenes, he and his team, led by his brother Bobby, were working relentlessly. Though his health remained a fragile, closely guarded secret, and his back often left him in agony. Kennedy was singularly focused on one goal: becoming President of the United States. In January 1960, at just 42 years old, he officially announced his candidacy for the Democratic presidential nomination. The skeptics were quick to circle. The list of his perceived weaknesses was long. He was too young, they said, too inexperienced in foreign policy. And then there was the biggest hurdle of all. He was a Roman Catholic. America had never elected a Catholic president. Anti-Catholic sentiment, though less overt than it had been in the past, still ran deep in many parts of the country, particularly in the South and Midwest. Many Protestants feared that a Catholic president would be beholden to the Pope in Rome, rather than to the American people. But Kennedy and his sharp, modern campaign team decided to confront the issue head-on. Instead of downplaying his religion, they leaned into the criticism and turned it into a test of American tolerance. The defining moment on this issue came during the primary campaign in West Virginia, a heavily Protestant state. In a powerful speech, he declared, "I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who also happens to be a Catholic. I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me." It was a masterful performance that helped diffuse the issue for many voters. His campaign for the nomination was a marvel of modern organization. It was sharp, well-funded, and built for the new medium that was changing politics forever: television. Jack was a natural on camera. He mastered it with an ease that few politicians possessed. His team understood the power of optics, charisma, and clear, concise messaging. After a series of hard-fought primary victories, he arrived at the Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles as the front-runner. After fending off a challenge from Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas, Kennedy secured the nomination. In a move that surprised many, he then asked Johnson, his rival, to be his vice presidential running mate. It was a purely strategic decision. Kennedy knew he needed Johnson's connections in the Senate and his appeal to Southern voters to have any chance of winning the general election. His Republican opponent was the sitting vice president, Richard Nixon. Nixon was a formidable opponent, experienced, intelligent, and known for his political cunning. The stage was set for one of the most famous and consequential elections in American history. The tipping point of the campaign came on September 26, 1960, with the first ever televised presidential debate. It was a moment that would fundamentally change American politics. Nixon, who had recently been hospitalized for a knee injury, had lost weight and looked pale and gaunt. He refused to wear makeup for the cameras, and his gray suit blended into the background of the set. He appeared sweaty, uncomfortable, and visibly tense under the bright studio lights. Kennedy, on the other hand, had spent the day preparing and resting. He was tanned, looked healthy, and wore a dark suit that made him stand out. He exuded an air of confidence, charm, and calm poise. For the millions of Americans watching at home, the visual contrast was stark. Radio listeners thought Nixon had won the debate based on the substance of his arguments, but the television audience, the vast majority of viewers, thought Kennedy had won decisively. For the first time, American voters weren't just listening to their candidates, they were watching them. Image had become just as important as issues, and they liked the image they saw in Kennedy. The election itself was one of the closest in U.S. history. The popular vote margin was razor thin. On election night, November 8, 1960, the country waited in suspense. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, Kennedy was declared the victor. At 43, he became the youngest man ever elected president and the first Catholic to hold the office. His inauguration in January 1961 was a major event. Despite a heavy snowstorm that blanketed Washington, D.C., massive crowds gathered to watch the young president take the oath of office. The speech he delivered on that frigid day became instantly iconic, a masterpiece of rhetoric that captured the spirit of a new generation. He spoke of a new frontier and challenged Americans to embrace civic action and public service. He delivered the line that would be etched into the memory of a nation. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. To many, both in America and around the world, it felt like a new era had truly begun, an era of vitality, vision, and hope. The Kennedy White House, with his beautiful wife Jacqueline and their 2 young children, would soon be nicknamed Camelot, a term borrowed from Arthurian legend that evoked a sense of grace, charm, and almost mythic promise. But behind the glittering public image lay immense challenges, both at home and abroad, that would test Jack's leadership to its very core. The world would be watching, and the honeymoon would not last long. Part 6, Trial by Fire. Foreign Policy. John F. Kennedy entered the White House with soaring expectations and the energy of a new generation. But he quickly discovered that the presidency was far less forgiving than the campaign trail. The Cold War against the Soviet Union was at its absolute peak. The threat of nuclear annihilation was not an abstract concept, it was a daily reality. Kennedy's presidency would be defined by this global struggle, and his first major test would come almost immediately, and it would become one of the most embarrassing foreign policy blunders in U.S. history. The plan was already on his desk when he took office. A covert operation conceived and developed by the CIA under the Eisenhower administration. The target was Cuba, the island nation just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, which had recently been taken over by a charismatic and defiant young revolutionary named Fidel Castro. Castro had aligned himself with the Soviet Union, creating a communist outpost on America's doorstep. The CIA's goal was to overthrow him. The strategy was to train and equip a small army of about 1,400 Cuban exiles who had fled Castro's regime. They would be landed covertly at a remote swampy area on the southern coast of Cuba called the Baja de Cachinos, or the Bay of Pigs. The CIA confidently assured the new president that the landing would spark a spontaneous popular uprising among the Cuban people, who would then join the exiles and topple Castro's government. The plan assumed that the U.S. role could be kept a secret, simple on paper, disastrous in execution. Kennedy was wary of the plan. It seemed too risky, too bold, but his top military and intelligence advisors, the experienced men he had inherited from the previous administration, all strongly urged him to approve it. They told him it was the only way to deal with the Castro problem. Feeling the pressure to appear strong and decisive so early in his presidency, Kennedy gave the green light, but with one crucial and ultimately fatal change. He drastically reduced the U.S. air support for the invasion, hoping to maintain deniability. On April 17, 1961, the invasion began, and it fell apart almost immediately. It was a catastrophe from start to finish. Castro's intelligence services knew the invasion was coming. His forces were well prepared and waiting for them. The promised popular uprising never happened. The Cuban people did not rise up in support of the invaders. The exiles were pinned down on the beaches, outgunned and outnumbered. Without effective U.S. air support, they stood no chance. Within 3 days, the operation had failed spectacularly. Over 100 of the exiles were killed, and nearly 1,200 were captured. The global press seized on the moment. The United States looked clumsy, arrogant, and incompetent. Kennedy, the young, dynamic leader, looked naive and foolish. Critics at home pounced. America's allies expressed their doubts, and America's enemies, particularly Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, mocked their failure. For the first time, Kennedy's cool, calm exterior began to crack, at least behind closed doors. He was furious at the CIA for giving him flawed intelligence, at the military for their overconfidence, and most of all, at himself. He had approved the plan, and now the full weight of the failure rested squarely on his shoulders. But it was in this moment of humiliation that JFK began to show a different kind of leadership. Rather than deflect blame or point fingers at his advisors, he went before the American people and the world and publicly took full and sole responsibility. Victory has 100 fathers, he famously said, but defeat is an orphan. It was a moment of remarkable accountability. The American people, instead of turning on him, respected his honesty. His approval ratings, paradoxically, actually rose. He had stumbled badly, but he had stood back up and owned his mistake. Privately, though, the Bay of Pigs haunted him. It was a searing lesson that he would never forget. It shattered his trust in the advice of his military and intelligence establishments. It made him deeply wary of expert opinions, quick solutions, and overconfident planners. It planted a seed of skepticism that would bear fruit in the tense months and years ahead, when the next crisis would not just risk embarrassment, but global annihilation. From that point forward, Kennedy vowed never to be blindly led into a decision again. The lesson was bitter, but it was necessary. In the nuclear age, decisions made in secret rooms could shake the entire world. And next time, he would be ready, because next time, the world would be even closer to the edge. That next time came in October 1962, a moment that no American president had ever encountered before, the very real, imminent possibility of all-out nuclear war. It began with photographs. High-altitude U-2 spy planes had flown over Cuba and captured unmistakable, terrifying evidence. The Soviet Union was secretly and rapidly installing medium and intermediate-range nuclear missile sites across the island. Once these missiles became operational, they would be able to strike nearly every major city in the United States, from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles. In a matter of minutes, the strategic balance of power in the Cold War would be fundamentally altered, and the U.S. would be under a direct and immediate nuclear threat. The stakes were unimaginable. Kennedy immediately assembled a small, secret group of his most trusted advisors, which came to be known as ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, for 13 days. From October 16th to October 28th, this group met in secret, debating how to respond. The atmosphere in the White House was incredibly tense. The fate of the world literally hung in the balance. The military leaders, the generals and admirals, almost unanimously argued for an immediate, massive airstrike on the missile sites, to be followed by a full-scale invasion of Cuba. They saw the Soviet move as an act of war and believed a swift, powerful military response was the only option. General Curtis LeMay, the head of the Air Force, famously told the president that anything less would be a terrible act of appeasement. But JFK remembered the Bay of Pigs. He remembered how badly the experts had been wrong. He knew how quickly and uncontrollably things could spiral when fueled by poor judgment and unchecked aggression. He feared that an attack on Cuba would force the Soviets to retaliate, perhaps by seizing West Berlin, which could trigger a full-scale war in Europe, leading inevitably to a nuclear exchange. He chose a different, more measured path, a path that was aggressive enough to show American resolve, but that also left room for diplomacy and a way out for his opponent. He decided on a naval quarantine of Cuba. He deliberately avoided the word blockade. Because a blockade is legally considered an act of war, the quarantine would prevent the Soviets from shipping any more military equipment to the island. On the evening of October 22nd, Kennedy went on national television and revealed the crisis to a terrified American public and the world. He announced the quarantine and made it clear that any missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. For the next several days, the world held its breath. It was the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. Soviet ships carrying missiles approached the quarantine line. American naval vessels were in position to stop them. U.S. military forces around the world were placed on DEFCON 2, the highest level of military alert short of actual war. Across the globe, people stocked bomb shelters, schools ran duck and cover drills, and everyone waited, listening to their radios, fearing the worst. In Washington, Kennedy kept a calm and resolute face in public while privately battling the immense weight of every single decision. One misstep, one misinterpreted signal, one ship captain making the wrong move, and millions of people could die. Then, through a series of remarkable and tense back-channel exchanges, a deal began to form. In a long, emotional letter to Kennedy, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev offered to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public U.S. promise not to invade the island. In a second, secret part of the deal, communicated through Kennedy's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the U.S. also agreed to remove its obsolete Jupiter missiles from Turkey at a later date. Kennedy accepted. The crisis ended. The Soviet ships turned back. The missiles were dismantled and withdrawn. War was averted. The Cuban Missile Crisis became Kennedy's defining moment as a leader. He had won, not through bold aggression, but through careful, patient, and firm restraint. He had stood his ground, but he had also allowed a path for his enemy to back down without total humiliation. He had learned from his failure at the Bay of Pigs. and that lesson had allowed him to navigate this far more dangerous crisis with wisdom and maturity. Afterward, he and Khrushchev, both shaken by how close they had come to catastrophe, installed the first direct communication link in the hot linear between Washington and Moscow to prevent future misunderstandings. Kennedy, more than ever, became a voice for peace and arms control. But he also knew something chilling. The world had come closer to nuclear destruction than most people would ever realize, and the clock, he knew, would always be ticking. Beyond the major crises, Kennedy's foreign policy was a complex mix of idealism and Cold War realism. He established the Peace Corps, an organization that sent young American volunteers to developing nations to help with education, farming, and healthcare. It was a brilliant soft power initiative that built goodwill around the world. He also launched the Alliance for Progress, an economic aid program for Latin America. However, his presidency also saw the United States become more deeply entangled in a conflict that would later tear the nation apart: Vietnam. Following the Cold War domino theory of the idea that if one country fell to communism, its neighbors would follow, Kennedy significantly increased the number of American military advisors in South Vietnam to help fight a communist insurgency. While he resisted pressure to send in combat troops, his administration supported a military coup that overthrew and assassinated the corrupt South Vietnamese president, Ngo Dinh Diem, just weeks before Kennedy's own death. Historians have debated ever since what Kennedy would have done in Vietnam had he lived. Would he have escalated the war as his successor Lyndon Johnson did, or would he have found a way to withdraw? It is one of the great unanswered questions of his presidency. After staring into the abyss of nuclear war and pulling the world back from the brink, John F. Kennedy emerged not only as a skilled tactician on the world stage, but as a president with a renewed sense of moral clarity. He knew that leading a nation wasn't just about confronting foreign threats. It was about forging a better, more just society at home. And so, in the final year of his presidency, Kennedy's focus shifted inward, toward what he had called the new frontier, a vision of progress in science, social justice, and equality. At the very heart of this domestic vision was the explosive issue of civil rights. The struggle for racial equality for African Americans had been simmering for decades, and by the early 1960s, it was boiling over. Across the American South, the system of racial segregation known as Jim Crow remained deeply entrenched. Black citizens were denied the right to vote, forced to attend separate and inferior schools, and subjected to daily humiliation and violence. A powerful, non-violent protest movement, led by figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., was rising up to challenge this injustice. Peaceful protesters, students sitting at segregated lunch counters, freedom riders challenging segregated buses, were being met with brutal violence from white mobs and local police, often with dogs, fire hoses, and clubs. Early in his presidency, Kennedy had been cautious and politically pragmatic on civil rights. He needed the powerful bloc of Southern Democrats in Congress to pass his other legislative priorities, and he was wary of alienating them. He believed in racial equality, but he tried to work behind the scenes, appointing African Americans to federal positions and using legal channels rather than moral leadership. But the escalating violence and the courage of the protesters were changing him. Events were forcing his hand. In 1962, when James Meredith, a black Air Force veteran, tried to enroll at the all-white University of Mississippi, the governor of the state personally blocked his path, sparking a massive riot. Kennedy had to send in thousands of federal troops to restore order and ensure Meredith could attend classes. The following year, in the spring of 1963, the world watched in horror as television news broadcast images from Birmingham, Alabama, where the notoriously brutal police commissioner, Eugene Buchanan, unleashed attack dogs and high-pressure fire hoses on peaceful demonstrators, many of whom were children. Then, in June, Medgar Evers, a prominent civil rights activist in Mississippi, was assassinated in his own driveway. For Kennedy, these events were a turning point. He could no longer stay on the sidelines. The issue was no longer just political, it was profoundly moral. On the evening of June 11, 1963, he went on television to address the nation. His voice was calm, but his words were revolutionary. "We are confronted primarily with a moral issue," he said. "It is as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise." For the first time, a sitting American president was fully and publicly embracing the moral argument for civil rights, framing it as a fundamental test of American democracy. A week later, he sent a comprehensive civil rights bill to Congress, which would outlaw segregation in public places and guarantee equal voting rights. That same summer, in August 1963, the civil rights movement reached a crescendo with the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. 250,000 people, black and white, gathered peacefully at the Lincoln Memorial in a powerful call for justice. It was here that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his legendary "I Have a Dream" speech. Kennedy had initially been nervous about the march, fearing it could lead to violence and jeopardize his civil rights bill. But he eventually gave it his support and met with King and other leaders at the White House afterward, a symbolic gesture of solidarity. Meanwhile, Kennedy's vision for a new frontier expanded to other areas. He was a passionate champion of space exploration. In a famous speech at Rice University in 1962, he famously declared that America chooses to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. For Kennedy, the space race against the Soviet Union wasn't just about Cold War competition or scientific achievement. It was about pushing the boundaries of human potential. It was a way to inspire the nation, particularly its young people, and to prove what a free and democratic society could accomplish when it dared to dream big. On the economic front, he proposed major tax cuts to stimulate growth, a policy that would be enacted after his death and would contribute to a long period of prosperity. He also took the first small steps toward what would later become the war on poverty. And yet, behind all the bold speeches, the televised optimism, and the image of youthful vigor, Jack's body was deteriorating. The constant pain from his back and the effects of Addison's disease were a daily struggle, a secret battle hidden from the public eye. He relied on a complex regimen of medications, including painkillers and stimulants, just to get through his grueling schedule. But he pressed forward with his signature charm, with a sense of hope, and with a clear understanding that time, for all of us, was finite. His new frontier was just beginning to take shape. The nation was energized, and a second term in office seemed almost certain. But fate had other plans. While President Kennedy was grappling with the immense pressures of the Cold War and the moral crisis of civil rights, the White House itself was undergoing a remarkable transformation. It was becoming a symbol not just of political power, but of culture, grace, and youthful energy. The world was captivated by the new first family, and the Kennedy White House was soon nicknamed Camelot, a name that would forever be associated with a sense of lost promise and golden age glamour. The architect of this transformation was the First Lady, Jacqueline Kennedy. More than just a political spouse, she was a woman of incredible style, intelligence, and historical sensibility. She found the White House to be worn down and decorated with uninspired department store furniture. She was determined to restore it to its original historical grandeur, to make it a true showpiece for the nation, a living museum of American history and culture. She established the White House Historical Association and undertook a massive, historically accurate restoration project, bringing back antique furniture and art from the eras of past presidents. In February 1962, she hosted a televised tour of the restored White House, which was watched by an astonishing 80 million Americans. She moved through the rooms with poise and knowledge, captivating the nation. She turned the White House from just the residence of the president into the people's house. Beyond the restoration, the Kennedys brought a new level of culture and sophistication to the executive mansion. They hosted elegant state dinners where the guest lists included not just politicians, but Nobel Prize-winning scientists, celebrated artists, poets, and musicians. The great cellist Pablo Casals, who had refused to play in the U.S. for years in protest of its foreign policy, agreed to perform at the Kennedy White House. These evenings were legendary, combining high-level diplomacy with intellectual and artistic brilliance. The image projected to the world was one of an America that valued not just power, but also art, science, and intellect. At the center of this glamorous image was the family itself, John F. Kennedy was the first president to grow up in the age of mass media, and he understood its power instinctively. The public was enchanted by the sight of the handsome young president and his beautiful wife with their two small children, Carolyn and John Jr. The White House photographer was given unprecedented access, capturing intimate family moments that were then released to the press. Pictures of the president playing with his children in the Oval Office, of little John hiding under the Resolute desk, and of Caroline riding her pony on the White House lawn created an irresistible image of a vibrant, happy, and relatable first family. It helped humanize the presidency in a way that had never been done before. This carefully crafted image of Camelot was a powerful political asset, but behind this perfect public facade was a far more complex and often troubled reality. The story we now know, something that would be covered in documentaries like The Dark Side of JFK the President, reveals a different picture. Kennedy's secret health struggles were a constant, daily ordeal. To manage his severe back pain and the effects of Addison's disease, he was on a complicated and ever-changing regimen of medications. His personal physician, Dr. Janet Travel, would often administer injections of painkillers and other drugs to get him through public appearances. The sheer amount of physical pain he endured on a daily basis while leading the free world is difficult to comprehend. And then there were his extramarital affairs. Kennedy's recklessness in his personal life stood in stark contrast to his calculated caution in his political life. His liaisons were numerous and well hidden from the public by a press corps that, in that era, generally did not report on the private lives of politicians. His affairs reportedly included everyone from White House interns to high-profile figures like the actress Marilyn Monroe and a woman with connections to the mafia named Judith Campbell Exnor. This behavior was not just a moral failing, it was a security risk, leaving him vulnerable to potential blackmail at the height of the Cold War. It's a part of his story that complicates the simple, heroic myth of Camelot, revealing a man who was deeply flawed and who took enormous personal risks. Yet, despite the hidden pain and the secret recklessness, Kennedy's public persona was undeniably magnetic. He was a master of television, especially in his live press conferences. He would stand at the podium, fielding questions with a remarkable combination of intelligence, confidence, and, most famously, a sharp, self-deprecating wit. He could diffuse a tense question with a clever joke, explain a complex policy with clarity, and project an image of a leader who was completely in command. These press conferences became must-see TV, and they further solidified his popularity with the American people. The story of the Kennedy White House is therefore a story of dualities. It was a place of high culture and of secret turmoil, a stage for a perfect family and the setting for a hidden life. It was the myth of Camelot, a beautiful and inspiring vision, and it was the complex, flawed, and very human reality of the man who presided over it. This combination of the public image and the private man is what makes John F. Kennedy one of the most fascinating and enduring figures in American history. In the fall of 1963, President John F. Kennedy was already looking ahead to the 1964 presidential election. While he was popular nationally, he faced a fractured Democratic Party in the crucial state of Texas. A bitter feud between the liberal and conservative wings of the party there threatened to cost him the state in the upcoming election. To mend these fences and bolster support, a political tour of Texas was planned for late November. The trip was meant to be a routine, if important, series of public appearances, motorcades, handshakes, speeches, and fundraisers. The trip began with successful stops in San Antonio, Houston, and Fort Worth. On the morning of Friday, November 22nd, it was a bright, clear day in Dallas. After a breakfast speech, the presidential party headed to Dallas Love Field Airport for the short flight to the city. The mood was optimistic. The crowds in the previous cities had been large and enthusiastic. The plan in Dallas was for a motorcade to travel through the city streets to the Trade Mart, where the president was scheduled to give another speech. Because the weather was so beautiful, the decision was made to remove the protective plastic bubble top from the presidential limousine, a dark blue, open-top Lincoln Continental. President Kennedy and his wife, Jacqueline, sat in the back seat. The governor of Texas, John Connally, and his wife, Nellie, sat in the jump seats directly in front of them. As the motorcade left the airport and began its slow journey through downtown Dallas, the streets were lined with cheering crowds. People waved, held up signs, and called out to the president. Kennedy, beaming his famous smile, waved back. Nellie Connolly turned to him and said, "Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you." Kennedy replied, "No, you certainly can't." Those would be the last words he would ever speak. At 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, as the motorcade made a slow left turn onto Elm Street and passed by a 7-story brick building called the Texas School Book Depository, the joyful atmosphere was shattered. Shots rang out. The sound was sharp, like a backfire, and for a moment, there was confusion. But then, it was clear what was happening. President Kennedy's hand suddenly flew up to his neck. He had been struck by a bullet that entered through his upper back and exited from his throat. Governor Connolly, sitting in front of him, was also hit and slumped over, seriously wounded. In the back seat, Jacqueline Kennedy turned to her husband in confusion and horror. Seconds later, a second, fatal shot hit the president in the head. The impact was devastating. The limousine, which had momentarily slowed, now accelerated, speeding towards the nearest hospital, Parkland Memorial. In the back of the car, a scene of unimaginable horror unfolded. The First Lady, in a state of shock, cradled her husband's head in her lap. The car arrived at the hospital within minutes. Doctors in the emergency room fought desperately to save him, but the wounds were catastrophic. At 1 p.m., just 30 minutes after the shots were fired, John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. He was just 46 years old. Back in Washington, and all across the country, the nation fell into a state of stunned, horrified silence. The news spread with shocking speed. Walter Cronkite, the respected CBS News anchor, famously removed his glasses and choked back tears as he announced the president's death to the nation. People cried openly in the streets. Schools closed. Businesses shut their doors. For many Americans, it felt as though the very soul of the country had been torn apart. The youthful, inspiring leader who had spoken of hope, space, and a new frontier was gone in a brutal, incomprehensible instant. The new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, was rushed to Air Force One, the presidential plane, at Love Field, just hours after the assassination. With a blood-stained Jacqueline Kennedy standing stoically at his side, Johnson was sworn in as the 36th President of the United States. Mrs. Kennedy, still in shock, had refused to change out of the pink suit she had been wearing. "I want them to see what they have done to Jack," she reportedly said. Within hours of the assassination, Dallas police arrested a suspect, a 24-year-old former Marine named Lee Harvey Oswald, who worked at the Texas School Book Depository. But the story took another shocking turn. Just 2 days later, as Oswald was being transferred from the city jail to the county jail, a Dallas nightclub owner named Jack Ruby stepped out of a crowd of reporters in the basement of the police station and shot Oswald at point-blank range, killing him. The murder was broadcast live on national television. The assassination of the president, followed by the public murder of the accused assassin, created a perfect storm for disbelief and suspicion. Conspiracy theories exploded almost immediately. Was it the Soviets, the Cubans, the Mafia, the CIA? For decades to come, the question of who really killed JFK and why would haunt the nation. John F. Kennedy's funeral was a national moment of profound mourning. World leaders and dignitaries from across the globe walked in a solemn procession. A riderless horse, with boots reversed in the stirrups to symbolize a fallen leader, followed his flag-draped casket, and in a single, heart-wrenching image that would be forever etched into America's collective memory, his 3-year-old son, John Jr., stood on the steps of the cathedral and raised his small hand in a final salute to his father's casket. The dream of Camelot was over. The world, it seemed, had stopped in Dallas. In the weeks, months, and years following his death, John F. Kennedy's life transformed from a political biography into an enduring American myth. The man who had once walked the halls of the White House became a symbol of youth, of hope, of boundless promise, and of what might have been. His presidency, though tragically brief at just over 1,000 days, left an indelible imprint that continues to shape American identity and global politics. To investigate the assassination, the new president, Lyndon Johnson, established the Warren Commission. After a lengthy investigation, the commission concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone, firing 3 shots from the Texas School Book Depository. But for millions of Americans, this explanation felt too simple, too neat, to explain such a monumental tragedy. The commission's report did little to quell the explosion of conspiracy theories, which have continued to be debated and analyzed ever since. The lack of a definitive, satisfying conclusion to the events in Dallas has allowed a permanent cloud of uncertainty to hang over his death, contributing to a growing public distrust in government that would mark the coming decades. Many remember him first and foremost for his words. His speeches were soaring, idealistic, and unforgettable. "Ask not what your country can do for you" became more than just a quote. It was a call to action that inspired an entire generation to enter public service, to join the Peace Corps, to fight for civil rights. He elevated the idea of civic duty, making ordinary people feel like they were part of something larger than themselves, something historic. In that way, he succeeded not just as a leader, but as a unifier and an inspiration. In foreign policy, Kennedy's greatest triumph was not a victory in battle, but an act of profound restraint. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, his refusal to bow to pressure for a military strike, his calm and calculated diplomacy, may very well have saved the world from a nuclear holocaust. His approach to the Cold War, grounded in realism but always reaching for peace, laid the groundwork for future arms control agreements, like the nuclear test ban treaty he signed in 1963. His vision for space exploration, realized years after his death when Neil Armstrong took humanity's first steps on the moon, was also a part of his legacy, a testament to his belief in pushing the boundaries of what is possible. Domestically, his legacy is more complex. His full civil rights agenda would only be passed into law after his death, championed and signed by his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson. And yet, it was Kennedy who fundamentally shifted the moral tone of the presidency on the issue of race. It was he who finally put the full moral authority of his office behind the cause of equality, paving the way for the legislative victories to come. But perhaps Kennedy's most lasting legacy isn't found in specific policies or political achievements. It's found in the powerful, almost mythic image he left behind. The young president, full of promise and vigor, the devoted father playing with his children in the Oval Office, the brilliant and witty leader who could charm a nation, and the man who, as we now know, endured constant physical pain with a smile, hiding his suffering from the world. His life was cut short, leaving behind a haunting silence and the eternal, unanswerable question, what if? What if he had lived? Would the Vietnam War have happened in the same way? Would the deep social and political divisions of the late 1960s have been avoided? We will never know. And it is in that uncertainty that the myth of Camelot finds its enduring power. It represents a moment in time that felt full of possibility, a brief, shining moment before a period of deep national trauma. Today, his image adorns coins and memorials. His name graces schools, airports, libraries, and the space center from which humanity launched its journey to the stars. But his real monument is carved into memory. It is the idea that leadership can be intelligent and inspiring, that public service is a noble calling, that even in a broken and dangerous world, a better future can be imagined, and that sometimes, the brightest lights shine for the shortest time, leaving an afterimage that never truly fades. The story of JFK is a powerful reminder that history is made by people who are often more complex, more flawed, and more fragile than the legends they leave behind. I hope this deep, extended journey into the real life of John F. Kennedy was as fascinating for you as it was for me. It proves that behind every well-known story, there's often an even more incredible, complex, and human one hidden from view. He was a man who lived with more secrets than almost anyone knew, from his health to his private life, all while staring the world through some of its most dangerous moments. If you enjoy digging deeper into the past and uncovering these kinds of stories that go beyond the headlines and the history books, please do me a favor and hit that like button. And more importantly, please subscribe to The Boring History Guy. Our whole goal here is to prove that history is never, ever boring when you know where to look. Let us know in the comments what you find most memorable or surprising about the life of JFK. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on our next deep dive into the past.